want to walk you through why we're in this position. If you haven't heard, and I suspect you have, it's part of the reason you're here, we are facing budget cuts. The state has imposed holdbacks. The governor has made those holdbacks permanent. And now we're looking at even deeper cuts. So we started at about 3% temporary, and then the governor turned those into permanent cuts. And now they've added a 4%, a fourth percent for this fiscal year. We're talking about the fiscal year we're in right now, so 26. We set a budget when we get to the legislature for fiscal year 27. And as of this week, we're looking at 5% cuts across the board for fiscal year 27. It's hard to explain how extraordinary those cuts are and how impactful they will be to all kinds of programs. We're talking about transportation funding. We're talking about K through 12 public education, universities, and those cuts across the board don't really explain the full impact of what's going on because there's other cuts that are being made to different programs. It will affect just about every aspect of Idahoans' lives. You know, your favorite camping spot. There will be impacts to what camping spots are available to you, how soon they're available to you, whether the bathrooms are clean. I know in this context that seems like a small thing, but my point is they are things big and small that we're going to be dealing with. All right, so we're going to answer, how did we get here, what cuts are being proposed, and how will they affect us, and then what options do we have instead of cuts? I want you to know I'm not a terribly partisan person. It's just not the way I think. But in order for me to tell you this story, I'm going to have to talk in some partisan terms because there is a majority party in the legislature. You may not know that, but it's about 86% Republican. And so when the majority party decides they're going to be lockstep on stuff, they are. And so if some of that creeps in, I don't want you to think I'm partisan or trying to insult anybody who might be a Republican. I'm not. I'm just trying to tell you what's going on. So you're going to be told by the Freedom Foundation and many Republicans in the legislature that the state of Idaho has a spending problem. That is not true. It's wrong. The state of Idaho has a revenue problem. Connor, let's go to slide 3. This slide right here shows you what the budgets looked like when we left in May. So the yellow line shows you the budget that we enacted as we finished the 2025 legislative session. The red line shows you how much revenue we were told that we had. And if you look at 2025, you can see that when we left with about $600 million. That's what the governor told the public. That's what the speaker told the public. That's what everybody was talking about, is we balanced our budgets and we still have $600 million. And there was a lot of chest beating, if you remember. We had done more tax cuts. We still passed our budgets. All is good. Well, it wasn't good. And I could spend 10 minutes explaining to you how we got to this position where we were saying something that was not true. But for sake of brevity, let's move to the next slide. Fiscal year starts 1 July. Almost immediately, we were seeing that the revenues were not what they were supposed to be. The revenues were overstated. And so quickly by August, it was clear, you can see that it was clear we were going to have deficits, and we can't run deficits. And every month that revenue came in, it came in lower than it was supposed to be. Now, lower than it was supposed to be, but as Lieutenant Governor Bedke says, he knew it was going to be coming in lower. He said, numbers don't lie. And so he was not surprised, and there were many of us who weren't surprised because we knew we had inflated the revenue number. So it was clear we were gonna have to cut budgets. That's when the governor came out and said we're gonna have to do a 3% holdback, and then very quickly, within a month or two, it was that holdback is gonna be permanent, and that brings us to where we are now. So you're being told that the state of Idaho, as we got ready for this session, that we were going to have a $555 million deficit for fiscal year 27. In other words, we came to the legislature, set budgets. We were going to have to find $555 million to cut. And it could be as high as $1 billion, and I'll explain that in a second. So how can that be? Where did all this money go? Well, keep in mind, we have had surpluses for several years. Between federal money coming into the state for COVID relief and then the infrastructure programs, we had a lot of federal money coming in. And when it comes in for road projects, or you name whatever the infrastructure project was, or COVID. People were receiving that money. They would go out and buy goods. That becomes sales tax. If you got a job that was paid for by some of this money, you're paying income tax. So all this federal money, it takes a while to flow through the system. And in the meantime, it turns into tax revenue. And so the legislature worked hard because we knew that was one-time money, and once it worked through the system, we couldn't build it into the budgets, right? It was revenue, but you don't want to build it in the budgets if it's one-time money. Legislature knew that. We talked about it all the time over the last 3-4 years. And we put a bunch of money into our rainy day funds. Our rainy day fund totals stand at about $1.6 billion. That's an extraordinary amount. So those were the positives, but somewhere along the way, the Idaho legislature got lost. And I'll tell you what it looked like. Led by Speaker Moyle, the majority party convinced itself that we could afford tax cuts again and again and again. Over the last 5 years, the Idaho legislature has flattened our income tax. We used to have a graded income tax where the more you made, you paid a little more. It wasn't a lot more, but your percentage was a little more. We flattened them so that now everybody pays 5.3%. And at the same time, the Idaho legislature cut income taxes by $4 billion over the last 5 years. $4 billion. Our general fund revenue that we use for our budgets, now there's federal money and other monies, but the general fund amount for an annual budget is around $5.3 billion. Over the last 5 years, we cut $4 billion out of our general funds. So that's, and looking forward, it's about $1.1 billion less every year that we will have available to spend upon schools, bridges, roads, state parks, Medicaid programs, you name it. So Idaho went from historic revenue surpluses to historic deficits because of bad fiscal management. If any legislator tells you different, tell them to show the receipts, because it was bad fiscal management. We should not be in the position that we're in right now. History is going to look back at this period of Idaho's spending and our budget management in utter disbelief. Slide 7. Last year alone, previous slide, we cut $450 million. That was last year's tax cut. We did a $50 million voucher program where we send to private schools and religious schools $50 million, and it is not accounted for. There is no oversight on how that money is spent. They don't have requirements on what it should be spent for. That is a revenue problem. It's not a spending problem. The winners of these tax cuts, by the way, just so you know, big corporations and people making $500,000 or more. A lot of you receive tax cuts. My guess is a lot of you don't even realize you did, because it was a couple $100, maybe $350. But the big winners, they know they received it. And by the way, we're not done digging. The first rule of holes is when you're in one, stop. Just this week, both chambers passed just this week, both chambers passed the conformity bill. Just briefly, what that is every year we look at the federal tax code and we say, to make it easier for everybody, let's make the Idaho tax code match the federal tax code. Most years it's kind of a no-brainer, it's the most boring bill that comes up, but not this year, because this year the big beautiful bill came along and it cut taxes on tips and it cut taxes on bonuses and a lot of corporate taxes. So there were all kinds of taxes. We only hear about some of them, but there were a ton of tax cuts in the big beautiful bill. If we conform at the state level, what does that mean? It means another tax cut that we can't afford. As I said, $555 million to $1 billion. The reason they were saying 555 to $1 billion is because of the big beautiful bill of tax conformity. We didn't know, we knew at least 555 million, but we didn't know what the tax conformity bill was going to cost. They are currently saying this week's bill said 155 million. That was the price tag they put on the bill. But at the same time, they acknowledged they really have no idea. They don't know. And they're not the only ones who don't know. There is so much uncertainty from the administration, the federal administration, and that's trickled down to the state, where we don't know what we're budgeting against. We don't know how much money we're truly going to have in the coffers. And so this tax conformity bill, the best estimates are 155 million to 300 million. So we could be looking at cutting budgets by about $800, $900 million to make things balance. All right. By the way, I mean, and I don't think I probably need to tell this group, but who's going to pay the price for these bad decisions? You will. I mean, it's going to be your school district, your kid's classroom, the Medicaid programs that you rely on, your neighbor who might lose their health insurance, your friend at ISU who's going to lose their job, your kid who's planning on going to Idaho State University or the University of Idaho or Boise State University, and now you find out that the program they've been wanting to go to forever is going to be capped. And so they might have to go out of state. And when they go out of state, they're going to pay out of state tuition. I could go on and on about just the small things that the Idaho legislature is not thinking about when it comes to these cuts. By the way, when we arrived in Boise in January, there were certain people there, specifically the speaker, who were working really hard to suggest cutting these budgets wasn't going to be a big deal. I don't know if you remember seeing him interview. That balancing the budget just wasn't going to be a big problem. Once again, wrong. The last time we faced empty coffers like this was in 2009 during the Great Recession. Diane and I were in the legislature serving at the time. We cut budgets to the bone. It was brutal. And I want to show you a slide. We hurt schools, people lost their jobs, they lost health care. The Idaho legislature dug itself a hole so deep that it took us 10 years to return to our public education spending to pre-recession levels. And in some areas, we still haven't recovered. So if you take a look at this graph, it shows you what happens when a state goes into a recession. This is public education, just a specific example, but you cut budgets and you can see you go from spending $10,000 plus per pupil all the way down to $6,500. And then between 2000, and that was after a recession in 2001. In 2006, we started making progress. We get to 2009, another recession, and we cut per pupil spending. And now we climb out. And you can see in 2016, around 18, Governor Little worked hard to get per pupil spending back up, more education money. And you can see it was working, and now we've hit where we are now. Where we are now is that line is going to dip again, and it's going to go down hard. And we will then try to climb out of it again for another decade. Now, those first two dips were from recessions. We aren't in a recession right now. In fact, if you listen to economists, they will tell you the Idaho economy is doing quite nicely. And we're in good shape. This is self-inflicted, what we've done here. Self-inflicted. All right. And we could go through other budgets to show you how it affected Medicaid transportation when we go through a recession. This is the chart that Freedom Foundation and a lot of Democrats who are pushing the cuts will show you. When you look at this chart, it shows you general fund growth by category. The categories are generally the different areas we spend money on in the state. So public schools, higher education, Medicaid, health and welfare. They especially don't like where the Medicaid line goes, because look at how it continues to increase. But you can see public schools. Now, so this is what they'll point to. They'll say since 2017, look at this, it's just out of control is how they describe it. What do they not take into consideration? Let's go to the next slide. This also shows you appropriations, so this shows you the money we're spending, it's climbing. Let's go to the next slide. Here's inflation. They don't take into consideration inflation. So the line you just looked at was not normalized for inflation. Let's go to the next slide. Idaho population. We have grown by 33%. 33% since 2010. If you normalize those budget expenditures using inflation and population growth, let's look at what that looks like. Right there. This shows you, and this is appropriations. I'm going to show you the next slide, which is expenditures. And then we'll flip back so you can see. These two slides show you appropriations are different than expenditures, but for our purposes, I think it's fine to just treat them the same. Look how little the increase in expenditures per person in the state of Idaho are. This is, as Keith Bybee, who is from Pocatello, but he's the JFAC head of budgets. He will tell you this is about as flat as can be, and what it tells you is we don't have out-of-control budgets. Our spending per person is conservative and flat. If you take into consideration inflation and population growth. All right. We've gone through those slides. Look, life has gotten more expensive. Everybody knows that. Inflation has affected every aspect of our lives. We've increased our population. I mentioned that. It's actually 33% over the last 20 years. That means more people driving on our roads, more people sending their kids to our schools, means more people going to our college, university, and yes, more people using Medicaid. But with all those new people, it should mean more income and sales tax going into the general fund. Unless, of course, you're the Idaho legislature and you cut general funds every year for the last 5 years to the tune of $4 billion. That is why we have a revenue problem. That is why the Idaho legislature is telling you that you're going to lose services, because they don't know how to balance their checkbook. All right. So, why would people in the Capitol suggest cutting the budgets isn't that big of a deal? Well, it's because if they acknowledge it is a big deal, they have to acknowledge something bad is about to happen. And if they acknowledge something bad is about to happen, they have to admit their role in it. And if they have to admit their role in it, they have to admit they screwed up. They have to admit that $4 billion in income tax cuts over the last 5 years was a mistake. And they have to admit that $450 million in tax cuts last year was a bad idea. And they have to admit that the $50 million voucher program was just bad policy. And they don't want to do that. And so they're going to go on telling you that the only solution is to cut. Now, that's how we got here. But we have other options, and I want to show you those, because Idaho can do better. The solution is really not that complicated. Let's look at slide 16. I told you that we went through a recession in 2009. Diane and I were there. In 2009, we did have rainy day funds, but we didn't have much. We had 641 million in rainy day funds, various accounts. That's the 2009 line. It was about 21% of our budget at the time. And we used a third the first year, a third the second year, and I can't remember whether we had to dip in the third year, Diane. But that was the plan, a third. I went and talked to the chief of staff back then, to Governor Otter, just to have him remind me what we did, and that's what he told me. In 2026, I mentioned we got all that federal money and we didn't want to build it in our budget, so we shoved a lot of it into rainy day funds. Very smart. In case we go into a recession or we have a sudden loss of revenue, here it is, $1.6 billion. If we used a third of that, it's about I'm going to do math on the fly, actually I did it here, $533 million. If we get rid of the voucher program, another 50, you are climbing up on $600 million right there. And we could put a trigger on that $450 million tax cut. We could just put a trigger on $250 million of it. In other words, it doesn't go into effect, the tax cut. So we don't get rid of it. We just say we're not putting it into effect until Idaho can afford it. And if we did that, you add another 250, you're already at 850 million. We could solve this problem really easily. Until then, good stewardship of the people's money sometimes means you just have to say no. So those are just a few solutions. Some are going to tell you the rainy day funds can't be used because we're not in a recession. There is no rule that says you can't use rainy day funds unless you're in a recession. The reason we use rainy day funds in a recession is because you have a sudden loss of revenue that you weren't expecting. You could argue we should have expected this, but that's why you use them, and you don't want to make your budgets go like this, because that's inefficient, you waste money, you shift costs to other parts of government. Some will say that it'll affect our credit rating. Also not true. Credit ratings are a lot more complicated than how much money you have in a rainy day fund. And we're not talking about using all the money. We're talking about using a third. We'll still have $1 billion in our rainy day funds. Look, during my time at West Point, my time in the military, I learned that people can accept the fact that their leaders screw up. People get it. We're all human. Nobody expects their leaders to be perfect. What they can't accept is when their leaders screw up and they won't own up to it. They don't like it when you shift the blame, when you say that black is white, up is down, bad is good. They don't like it. And they know it. And I think the people of Idaho have figured out what's going on here. They know that the legislature screwed up in how they managed the state's money, in how they managed your money, your taxpayer money. They just don't think you'll do anything about it. Well, tonight is one attempt to do something about it. I want to hear from you. This is what we can do right here, right now. There's more. There's always November. But for right now, this is what we can do, and so this is what we're going to do. I think these solutions, they're measured, they're thoughtful. Frankly, I think they're quite Idaho. It'll save our Medicaid programs, our public schools, our communities. Won't have to go through the pain, and our families won't have to go through that pain either. We can fix this problem, but legislators have to hear that they want you to use the rainy day funds. It'll get us through a year, and maybe our revenues return, but it gets us a year while we figure out more thoughtful solutions than just slash and burn. And right now, that's what the solution is that's being proposed. I really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you listening to